Welcome to the Robert and Frances Fullerton Museum of Art on the California State San Bernardino campus. My name is Brian Kramer. I'm joined by Kate Liska and Meredith Brand, and today we're going to take you on a tour of the exhibit, A Journey to the Beyond. Recently, we reopened our doors after 2 years of being closed during the COVID-19 pandemic. During the pandemic, we weren't idle. We decided that we would take the objects of our ancient Egyptian exhibit off display. We would digitize them using photogrammetry as 3D models. We put them on Sketchfab, and now we have them available to the public online. You can go to Sketchfab and type in RAFMA and look at all of our objects, or you can go to our website and go through a 3D walkthrough of our exhibit, click on each object, learn a little bit about it, zoom in, zoom out, and see things that you couldn't even see in person. For this effort, a group of students and staff working at RAFMA put in 2 years of work to take all of the objects offline, digitize them using photogrammetry, and put them online again so that you can view them up close and in person. And now we're proud to say that we can offer this to the public who may not be able to come to San Bernardino to see the exhibit in person, but we do encourage you to come visit. There are some really cool things to see.
Hello everyone, I wanted to introduce you to Hetep Harries. She welcomes everybody to our exhibition of Journey to the Beyond here at the Robert and Frances Fullerton Museum of Art. She is an ex-Herrera collection, which means that she was donated to the museum by Dr. Benson Herrera a few years ago. And she has been one of the pinnacle pieces that has been part of the 3D modeling efforts here. So definitely check out her 3D model on Sketchfab and link to the museum also. But she is really an excellent piece. She is a young girl, which you can tell because she is nude, as most pre-adolescent children are, and because her hand is gestured towards her mouth, even though it is slightly broken off. These are indications of children. The statue was originally painted. She would have had yellow skin, as you can see on parts of her body, and her hair around the side is quite black. If you look at the 3D model, you actually see that her back has been shaved down as well. And that's because she was originally part of a set of statues that I'll talk about in a minute that were actually up against a wall. And when they were taken out of the tomb, they were cut off. So you can actually physically see how she was removed from her historic home in her tomb in Giza. So the question is where is Hetep Harries from? Now, Hetep Harries' left arm is also slightly raised. And like most children in ancient Egypt, or especially in the statuary, they will embrace the leg often of their parent. And so you can see from this type of gesture that there's probably a much taller figure next to her. And luckily, the Egyptologist John Cooney in 1936 put all of this together. What had actually happened was in the late 1800s or early 1900s, she was within the tomb of her father, a man by the name of Raware, who I'll talk about in a minute. And this Stet of Raware, his wife, and 2 of her brothers were removed from the tomb by being cut out. And when they were removed from the tomb, each of the 5 figures were actually cut into 5 different pieces and are now in 5 different museums. They are here in San Bernardino, but they're also in the Worcester Museum. There's 1 piece in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, 1 in Brooklyn, and 1 in Kansas City at the Nelkin Atkinson Museum. So all of these 5 pieces were originally together as one set of a family. But unfortunately, they were all sold separately. But then the Egyptologist Salim Hassan actually ended up excavating the tomb of Raware and putting together the publication in 1930, which allowed John Cooney to put this puzzle together, because there still in the tomb in Giza are the feet of all 5 of them. And not only do you have all of their feet in a line, so you can see how they all get positioned, you actually have their names and titles. So you know that young Hetep Harries, the daughter, was actually named after her paternal grandmother, also named Hetep Harries. You know that her dad and her brother were both named Raware. And you also learn that her father was in fact the famous Raware that has the really awesome biography from the 5th dynasty. He was in fact the guy that the king Nefer-ir-Ka-Re accidentally hit with his scepter while walking through a festival procession, and the power of the pharaoh's scepter was thought to actually magically harm him, that the pharaoh stopped the entire procession to perform the ritual to heal Ra so he wouldn't die from the pharaoh's eternal power walking by. So her dad was actually a very high official, and she was within the tomb with him at this time. And it is in her father's tomb where the entire family would be remembered through these statues in their places above ground. It was here where the ancestors could remember them for years to come and offer to them for the future. So one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about Hetep Heres in particular is because of 3D modeling. With the expansion of 3D modeling in the world, we can actually bring together virtually all of her individual family members to put a model of the entire unit together. Plus, because of Salim Hassan's publication of the tomb and the fact that the tomb is still in Giza, we could in fact model the entire tomb, and in a virtual reality or an augmented reality part of the museum, be able to set Hetep Heres not just back in with her family, but also within her space in Giza.
So 2 objects I'm going to show you today happen to be some of my favorite on display in the exhibit and in the entire museum. They're both statues of Osiris, or a version of Osiris. And they came to us after an interesting object history that a lot of the objects share in the collections at RAFMA. Both of these objects came from the Drexel collection. That is a collection of objects that was actually sold by the Cairo Museum in 1895 to Colonel Anthony Drexel. And after it was in the Drexel Institute, now at Drexel University, it went to the Minnesota Institute of Art, and it was eventually sold in 1956. And at that point, a few years later, Dr. Benson Harrer purchased the objects as part of his interest in reacquiring this collection and bringing it back together, and he eventually donated it to RAFMA. So a lot of the objects on display in the Journey to the Beyond actually have this same provenance history. They go back to the Drexel collection and eventually to the Cairo Museum. And that's very interesting because you can then talk about where these things came from. They were excavated in the 1890s in Egypt. In the case of these 2 objects, we actually know where they were found. So the first object I'm going to show you today is the one right behind me, this image of Osiris. Looks a lot like a statue. It's actually a papyrus sheath. Now, many of you probably know what a papyrus sheath is. It's a statue designed to hold a secret document, most often a copy of the Book of the Dead. We know that this object was probably found in the first priestly cache in 1891. And so it was designed to hold one of the books of the dead that belonged to a priest of the god Amun, placed in the priestly cache. You might even be able to go to Cairo Museum and see it on the walls nowadays. It's a very large version of one of these papyrus sheaths. In fact, the interior of it is about 45 centimeters deep. And that would accommodate almost any copy of the Book of the Dead from the first priestly cache. But only a few of the papyri are large enough to fill most of that space. So there's a good chance that this belongs to either Pa-Nisutawi or Cha-Nefer-A, 2 owners of some of the largest copies of the Book of the Dead. Now, I like this object because it doesn't have an inscription on it, and so you have to interpret it based solely on the imagery. And if you study the objects like this, you will find that they're cataloged according to Martin Raven's typology of them. This is a Type 2C Osiris statue, Papyrus Sheath. And this type usually doesn't have text on them, so it's hard to figure out what they really are. This one, because it looks so much like the god Osiris, I think has an allegorical interpretation. And it relates especially to the theme of the Journey to the Beyond, going into the afterlife and being successful at that transition. And my interpretation of it is, this object was designed to hold the Book of the Dead of one of these priests. And in the Book of the Dead of one of these priests, it shows the whole transition, or an abbreviated version of the transition into the afterlife, where he was successful. So by inserting it inside of the statue of the god Osiris, not only are you giving it a little bit of stamp of authority of the god on it, but you're also directly attaching that journey to the myth of the god. And in the myth of Osiris, he was successful at that transition to the afterlife. This image actually shows the moment of Osiris's reawakening from the dead after he's been mummified. And he's depicted in the manner of a triumphant ancient Egyptian king. So by putting a Book of the Dead inside that shows the person's journey, he's, so to speak, holding onto the coattails of Osiris as he makes his journey into the afterlife.
Most museums have fantastic collections of small finds, such as this. These are objects from the Robert and Frances Fullerton Museum of Art collection, and these relate to daily life in ancient Egypt and are also found in tombs. Now, these objects generally don't get the attention that things like statues and stelae usually receive, but they're still very important artifacts. And many scholars now are turning attention to small finds to get more information about life in ancient Egypt. The RAFMA has 3D scanned these small finds, and they're fantastic chances for scholars to look at these artifacts from every different angle to study them in full detail to understand their technology so that we can get insights into how they're made and research things like production and consumption and find distribution of these artifacts. So 3D modeling allows us to see these pieces and allows researchers from all around the world to appreciate the full value of small finds. I want to highlight two special collections in these small finds. One of them is this dummy vessel from the 18th dynasty. These kind of vessels are unique because they are completely solid. They're not hollow in the middle. They weren't intended to hold anything, which is why we call them dummy vessels. This one in particular is made out of wood, and that it's painted. And if you notice, the painting is kind of wavy, and it's trying to emulate veins of stone. So it's emulating a stone vessel. These kind of dummy vessels that imitate stone pots, they were pretty popular in the 18th dynasty. And there's some famous ones from the tomb of Yuya and Tuya. These are the in-laws of Amenhotep III that are found in the Cairo Museum. This was a big fashion in the 18th dynasty, and it's lovely that we have examples of them here in the Robert and Frances Fullerton Museum of Art. The second artifact is the cosmetic spoon. These are quite common from ancient Egypt. Ancient Egyptians would have put ground up makeup into the spoon part, and then they would have used a stick applicator to apply the makeup all over their face, particularly their eyes. So this spoon is a common motif from the New Kingdom, and it's of a young woman swimming alongside of a duck. And the actual ground up makeup would have gone inside the belly of the duck. This artifact is made out of ebony wood, and this wood would have come from Nubia, and so that gives us some insight into the trade between Egypt and Nubia for wood products. Also, it raises questions of perhaps maybe this young woman is Nubian. Interestingly, the 3D modeling of this spoon allows us to see how this artifact was made. So for any researcher curious about cosmetic spoons and wanting to know all the variant ways that they can be produced, they can see that this spoon was made with a head from a separate piece of wood attached to the body, and then the duck that the woman is carrying is made from a different piece of wood, and they're all combined together. So having a 3D model of this artifact allows researchers to help understand technology of these important pieces.
Another object that we have done wonderful 3D modeling with here at the Robert and Frances Fullerton Museum of Art is this Ancestor Bust that is a recent donation to the museum by Dr. Benson Herrera and will be a permanent member of our collection. So we're very excited because this piece is actually incredibly unique. So for those of you who don't know, ancestor busts were used as the pinnacle of domestic religion in a person's house during the mid to late part of the New Kingdom and a little bit into the Third Intermediate period. Essentially, you would create or you would keep a bust that could represent most of the ancestors or most of the family members in your particular home for you to then worship in your own regard. And so it brings about the connection to the past and the connection of allowing people to live on, although there is a big debate about their exact purpose. Most ancestor busts come from Deir el-Medina, but they've actually been found at about 17 different sites, including at Amarna and Elephantine, Ashmunain, and several others too. This ancestor bust is actually quite nice. It's made out of limestone and it has very lovely carving of the facial features. It was probably originally painted. You can actually see some of the paint lines around the ear and around the hairline, especially when you look at the 3D model in particular. But the face and the rest of the bust actually seem to be carved almost with two different hands. So it might have actually been carved by at least two different craftsmen within a workshop also. Now, if you look at the base of the ancestor bust around the tripartite wig, you actually see a very unique scene. The bust has a broad collar etched onto it, and then around the sides, on the shoulders, you have very rudimentary or simplified lotus symbols. And again, if you look at the model, you can see those fairly well. The lotus symbol is actually quite unique. Usually when these types of decorations are made, they're papyrus symbols, making this particular bust special as well. And when you look at the back of the 3D model, there's no etching, no carving in the slightest, which is another great thing to see, is to be able to see the backs of these. So because the back is absolutely empty of everything, one might assume that it was placed in a niche or it was placed against a wall and the back was never actually meant to be viewed by people. Now, underneath the broad collar, you actually have a very interesting scene of a man making some sort of offerings. His hands are open as opposed to upwards like this, which is usually a praising gesture. And there are two vertical lines going down. People would wonder if he was actually holding staffs. But the 3D modeling is really cool because you realize that the first line that comes down with his left hand is actually a drip of paint, and it's not a staff at all. So in fact, it really does look like his hands are open, making an offering. And the other unique thing that we have here is what he's making an offering to. Directly in the center of the bust, we have the beginning of a Hetep di Nesu formula, the standard offering formula gifted to people. And the translation is an offering that the king gives Osiris, ... and then it breaks off. So very standard type of offering. But with the space available on the bust, not much of it would have continued. So it was always meant to be an abbreviated offering that was a part for the whole. However, the use of an offering formula on an ancestor bust is quite rare. If you look at Jean Louis Keith's book, she only notes one other example in Berlin. And based on these artistic nuances of this particular image, she also dates this bust to the 20th or possibly 21st dynasty, because she thinks that a lot of the facial features that are in this particular image are archaizing back to the Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom. So I encourage you to look at this particular image in detail if you can online, and then I encourage you more to come to the museum and see it in person.
So the second object I'd like to show you today is this Ta Soker Osiris statuette. Now, these have been found in tombs of the late period, and this type, which is Martian Ravens type 4A, is specifically of the Nectanebyan and Ptolemaic period. You can actually tell that based on the decoration on the body, which imitates real decoration found on coffins of that time. And this object, again, we can talk about where it came from, and it also has on the front a Hetep di Nesu formula that names the owner. And the owner is actually probably a known individual. It names a man named Jedhor, son of Satmeticus and Asetweret. And it names a version of the god Sokar from the town of Akhmim. So there's actually a person with that name found on some objects in the British Museum, specifically a very lovely outer anthropoid sarcophagus. So very likely this may have come from the same tomb or possibly been someone in the same family, but at least it is the same area of Akhmim. Now, these objects are kind of interesting in that we find them throughout tombs of the late period, but we don't actually know their specific purpose. There's no text explaining what they're for. But I think I have another idea, and it relates to the last object I told you about. And that is due to the text that's sometimes found on this type, type 4. This text addresses the object as the heir of this god, Iwa and Necherpen. So who is Necherpen? Well, you find that as a reference to the mummy of a person, for example, in the embalming ritual, but it could also refer to the god Osiris. And as the heir, the Iwa of this god, it recalls the address of the Sokar version of Osiris found in the rituals of the month of Khoiak, specifically in the Lamentations of Isis and Nephthys. They refer to the Iwa of Osiris. And the other parts of that text actually allude to the making of Osiris out of various divine substances. They call him the lord of the Abydos Nome and the constellation Orion in the sky. And all of those allusions relate to a topic I've been studying concerning the celebration of the ritual of Osiris. But these are found in private tombs. So what's going on? Why are they there? Well, again, I think like at the last object, people are appropriating the imagery, the ritual imagery of the god Osiris. They're taking with them a little miniature version of themselves, like the god Osiris had a little miniature version or a second version of himself in the practice of the Khoyak rituals. And so this is a theme of journeying to the beyond, to appropriate things done for the god Osiris for yourself in your own tomb. Thank you for joining us on our journey to the beyond at the Robert and Frances Fullerton Museum of Art. Check out our website, and we'll be available for questions right after this.